for years by one of your esteemed predecessors when the IPCC was recognized by the world and given the Nobel Prize. We are that organization which believes strongly in science. We are that organization which thinks that what the IPCC says, and we understand some of those politics, but what you say should be guiding light for us and a lodestar for us. We are therefore honored and extremely delighted, and I want to echo what Dr. Dhawan said. Thank you for honoring those students, for them who are the tomorrow's climate activists, sustainability activists. Nothing perhaps could be more valuable than that one photograph with you taking their diploma, taking their degree. But I today, I have a unique honor. I spent many years of my life being that negotiator. For many people, I was the big naysayer. But you know, my hairs have grayed, perhaps turned a bit white, and as a result of all of this, I become more mature and more understanding that the world that we have, it's very nice to fight for your own space. It's very nice to say, I will be great and make myself great or whatever else you want to. But it's very important that our world is great. And that's important. And I take you back to what Dr. Dhawan said. We must be responsible, and more than that, we must live on hope. And that's what we wait for you. So thank you very much. I'm very delighted that you've agreed to be with us and take part in this, what is called the fireside chat. She mentioned the temperatures are already too high for a fireside, but whatever, we will do something. We will. So thank you very much.
Okay, and may I actually say, I mean, I'm just remembering the first time I ever came to India was about 1990, and I think I came to the first ever climate conference in India, which was hosted by Pachauri, and that was the first time I met him. So it's wonderful to be back 35 years later.
Professor Ski, thank you very much. I want to tell all of you, if I'm not mistaken, the year was 1988. 89, when the first UN resolution on climate change was adopted and the IPCC was set up as a consequence.
Yeah, the IPCC had just been created, but there was no UN Framework Convention.
No, Framework Convention came later. It needed you for the Framework Convention to be created. I want to ask you a simple, straightforward question today. You heard our Director General mention, but the simple question is, what is the science telling us today?
What the science, I think, is telling us is that, I mean, first of all, for the first time in the last cycle, we said human influence is unequivocally the cause of the climate change that we're seeing. And we got every one of the countries in IPCC to sign up to that. That is an incredibly strong consensus. If you think back to the early 1990s, the existential question was, is climate change happening? We answered that. And then we answered the question, is we human beings through our activities that have led to these changes that we're seeing? And I think that's an incredibly strong statement. Now, the other thing I think that you mentioned in your opening remarks was the question about hope. Now, we have thought a lot about how to message IPCC's scientific findings, because one way of doing it is to try to frighten people into action by raising all the very difficult, one frightening kind of things that may be happening. But we are trying to get a balance now to think that there is agency as well. We human beings hold our future in our hands. So let's look to the hope, let's look for the opportunities that face us. And certainly in our reports in Working Group 2 on impacts and adaptation and 3 on mitigation, we have made a strong effort to emphasise the fact the future is in our hands. It's not inevitable. Don't despair.
Professor Ski, thank you very much. Hope at the end of the day is perhaps most important. But perhaps equally important is that there's reason for hope. Thank you for underlining that. Let me ask you one or two things. A lot of the efforts in the negotiations, what people distill out of the IPCC reports is the action on mitigation. We often leave out the ideas on adaptation. After all, so much of this is already there and we can't do anything about it. We come from the developing world. Today, the largest country in the developing world, why in the entire world? And our needs are tremendous. So I'd like you to speak for a few minutes on the issue of adaptation. I'll ask you something or the other on the big subject, which is mitigation.
Yeah, and just a minute, I mean, I've done 2 or 3 presentations today already, and there are 10,000 pages of IPCC reports from the last cycle, and I'm often tried to sum them up in 5 or 10 minutes. This is a significant challenge, and the way I've started to approach it is to look at the 3 goals of the Paris Agreement. There's a long-term temperature goal, which sure is mitigation, but we have a goal on adaptation and enhancing resilience, and we have a goal on enhancing financial flows from developed to developing countries. So it's a constant reminder for me, it's not just about mitigation, it's about the whole suite of the goals and how they interact with each other. And the point I constantly make is these goals are mutually reinforcing. We will not achieve sustainable development, we will not eradicate poverty unless all of these 3 goals are pursued. And moreover, we can't pursue any one of the goals without pursuing all of them. They're very much interlinked. So the point about we may have been dominated by mitigation in the past, the coming IPCC cycle is going to be dominated by adaptation as a theme. The governments have asked us to produce a set of guidelines on the assessment of impacts and adaptation, with an emphasis to make it a bit harder, metrics, indicators, methodologies, because the mitigation has the luxury. We can all take it down to one indicator, carbon dioxide equivalent. Adaptation is tough because there are no easy indicators, and adaptation measures are tied up to infrastructure investment, development more broadly. It's much, much more difficult and much more challenging. And if you look at the outlines of the reports that we agreed in Hangzhou in China last week, you will see a much greater emphasis on adaptation. For example, within the Working Group 2 report, the word adaptation did not appear in its chapter titles in AR6. Now it is all over the place. We have moved on. There is a chapter on the science for losses and damages, which was never there previously. So I do think that we have moved on a considerable degree, and both the mitigation and the adaptation reports have chapters on finance explicitly. I always find it difficult to talk about Europe now that the UK is no longer a member of the European Union. To my great regrets, I should say, I will absolutely, that's the only personal opinion I will express tonight. But I do think when you look at the processes that we went through last week, and you look at the outline, especially of the Working Group 3 mitigation report, you can see in the chapter structure and in the details a much greater attention to the other issues like equity, sustainable development. We have what was once upon a time the scenarios chapter now talks about futures in the context of mitigation and sustainable development. So it has shifted it has given sustainable development an equal weight with mitigation in the mitigation report. And we have a whole chapter called Mitigation and Sustainable Development to explore the linkages. And that is something that we got agreement from all of the countries for. We reached consensus on that structure. So given, to be quite honest, the Europeans are quite vocal in the meetings and there are quite a lot of voices. The fact that we got there, I think is quite significant.
Very happy. IPCC is itself focusing on it. Again, is I think particularly positive for all of us. Of course, I noticed that one part of your room is now perhaps empty. I don't know about all that. We'll take that up in a little while. Weizhaski, we've budgeted roughly about 30 minutes here. We understand you've traveled and so on. But I would like, if you agree, to open it up to our colleagues here, who are truly the ambassadors for climate, resources and so on. So all of you have an opportunity. Please do have a question, do ask. Sherry Kedia, that includes you, Advocate Chima, it includes all the good people who are here. Surely somebody has some question to ask.
Chairman of the Mobius Foundation, which works on sustainability. I want to ask that we have 3 countries, that is China, USA and India?
Blended range of questions. I like to be challenged. The IPCC chair is assumed to be an expert on everything, so I will approach this with humility. Just to say, IPCC has grasped the idea of consumption patterns and human behaviour in the way that it influences greenhouse gas emissions. In the 6th cycle, with a lot of pushing from myself and my colleague Professor Shukla from Ahmedabad, we got a chapter in there on consumption and behaviour. And just to say, it's also in the outline for the next cycle as well, so we will continue. I was slightly disappointed with the chapter we produced last time because it was very good at explaining what the potential for reducing emissions and adopting sustainable lifestyles. It needed much more for me on the policies that would nudge people and move them, the kind of frameworks that you needed to move people along. So that is what I would really like. So I will be looking. Last time I was in India was 2 years ago, just as the LIFE program was launching. So I remember talking to the individual responsible for it in the ministry about some of the issues. So one of the things I'm very interested in is to look backwards at these kinds of policy pushes as they come through, to understand how successful they've been, whether they've made a difference, and whether there are lessons learned from one place to another about how you can actually nudge, bringing people along with you, not telling them what to do. That is fateful. You need to include people. Just transition applies to consumption, I think, just as much as production.
No, thank you very much.